Hello, my friends, and welcome back to the book of Psalms. Today, we're going to be looking at Psalms 42 through 44, and these Psalms are actually, I think, the first one that we've looked at so far that are not going to be attributed to David. They're actually instead written by the sons of Korah. Now, Korah was the tribe was of the tribe of Levi, remember the priestly tribe of Israel, but they broke away from Moses and Aaron and they settled on their own. So that's who they are. And anyway, looking at Psalm 42. Sometimes it feels like God has taken a long distance trip and not informed us when he'll return. The first thing to do in these situations is to draw from past experiences with God. The psalmist here recalls when he celebrated with God's people in verse 4. Then he counsels himself with the truth. He asks himself why he is so dejected and filled with turmoil. Then he urges himself, despite the darkness, to put his hope in God. So this is an important thing for us to remember and to do. We should keep track of the times when God has come through for us. It's important to have history with God so that during the bad times you can remember the good times that helped you to persevere. In addition, remember what you know to be true about God. He's faithful and he's worth hoping in. To hope is to expectantly wait for God to act. Just because you can't see God working doesn't mean that he's inactive. It doesn't mean he's not doing anything, and it certainly doesn't mean that he's forgotten you. So remember, when things get bad, when we're struggling, when times are tough, remember those times when things were good. Remember what God did for us before. Remember how he's answered our prayers before. And if we can do that, it's going to just strengthen the hope that we have in God and the hope that he's going to take care of us no matter what we're going through. So then when we look at verses 6 to 8, we see the psalmist's emotional life is kind of like a seesaw. He's up and down. His trying circumstances are like waves sweeping over him, he says in verse 7. He pictures himself rocked by an enormous wave only to be overrun by another as soon as it passes. But again, he prays for and hopes in God's faithful love. Like a child frightened in the night by a thunderstorm, he longs for his father's perseverance, not to stop the storm, but to remind him that he isn't alone. How many of us need this reminder from time to time? We don't necessarily need God to stop our trials or whatever it is we're going through, although that would be nice, but we really want to feel like we aren't alone. We just want to feel his presence. We can know that God is with us always, but sometimes it just doesn't feel like it, and those times can be really hard. And that's what the psalmist is asking for here. That brings us to Psalm 43. In verse 3, he asks God to send his light and his truth. He's asking him for divine understanding and revelation to guide him back to God's temple. We can probably relate to verse 5 because, like the psalmist, we often have to talk to ourselves in the midst of our despair. We need to remind ourselves that God is worthy of our trust and that we should expect him to answer in a way that will give us a new reason to give fresh praise. Now remember, that doesn't always mean that he's going to answer our prayers the way we want him to, but it does mean that he's going to answer them in a way that will be a blessing to us. And that brings us to Psalm 44. This one begins with telling us that he and his fellow Israelites had heard from the ancestors about the work that God accomplished on their behalf long ago. He had displaced other nations and instead planted Israel's family in the land that he had promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. None of this happened as a result of their own strength, but because God gave them the victory. Because of what God had done in the past, the psalmist and those with him could trust their divine king to provide continuing victories for them. Though they would have to battle their enemies, the psalmist knew that success didn't ultimately come from his bow or his sword. Victory comes from the Lord, in whom they could rightly boast. He also acknowledges then in verse 9 that just as victory comes from the Lord, so does defeat. And when they lose in battle, it's because God made it so. Verse 26 is another that we can probably relate to as he pleads for God to help because of his love for them. When you experience unjust suffering and it seems that God has abandoned you, don't cease trusting him. Remember what he has done in the past. Understand that suffering is part of the experience of God's people on this fallen earth and trust him to deliver you according to his faithfulness. And that is it for these Psalms today, guys. We know that God loves us, and even when we are struggling, we need to have faith that God loves us and trust that he's going to deliver us according to his faithfulness. Our God is faithful, our God is real, and our God is true. So when we go through difficult times, don't lose hope. Remember the times when God has been there for us. Remember the times when God has come through, and realize that our God is faithful and he's going to come through again in his time, even if we don't like that timing. So that's all for today. I will see you guys tomorrow in the book of Job.